In the 1950s and 60s, civil rights movements swept across the United States. Millions of Americans protested across the country, demanding equal rights. The issue of desegregation of American schools was also one of the biggest things that Black Americans strived for. On November 14, 1960, Ruby Bridges became the first black child to attend a previously all-white school in Louisiana. This monumental event helped fuel further calls for segregation across the country. In the 1960s, Boston schools were heavily segregated. In 1965, the Racial Imbalance Act found that there were 55, quote, racially imbalanced schools in Boston alone. When compared to white schools, all black schools in Boston suffered from poor conditions and a lack of funding. School supplies were hard to come by, as were many other basic necessities such as desks, pencils, textbooks, and paper.
There was no gym. There was no gym class because the gym of this elementary school had been converted into 3 classrooms in which kids had no barriers or physical separation from the other classes. And in addition to that, there were broken windows along the gym wall, with cardboard stuffed in some. So it was like he wrote about this and people couldn't believe it, but it shed light on what the parents of Boston's black community and leaders had been saying for a long time. And then the decision in the court cases forced Boston eventually to come up with some kind of plan on desegregating its schools.
In 1972, black parents and the NAACP sued the Boston School Committee, citing unfair segregation in Boston schools. In response to the lawsuit, Judge W. Arthur Garrity ruled that the Boston School Committee was guilty of maintaining 2 separate school systems. He ordered immediate remedy, citywide busing. Students were to be bused across Greater Boston in order to integrate schools. This remedy garnered polarized reactions from black and white Bostonians.
It's actually really scary for both sides. For a lot of the African American parents, it is seen as sort of finally gaining access to things that they have known they haven't had. They've been fighting this fight around segregation for a very long time. I mean, the first school desegregation or segregation case was actually in Boston in 1854. And so blacks sort of see this as finally an attempt to get access to schools that they can, you know, their kids can achieve an equal education.
Many whites, on the other hand, were upset with the busing solution, mainly for both racial and convenience reasons.
I wouldn't care if they were green or purple. It's the idea of putting my kid on a bus when I have a school right across the street from where they should go. I don't care what color they are.
They'll change this law.
It's like it's supposed to be a free country.
It's getting in the country now that they're telling you to do this and do this now, and you won't even have no freedom.
All I want is a seat in their school. Hey, nothing else. Let us go to our neighborhoods where our kids are safe. We want our kids safe. We want our children safe. And more.
Nevertheless, planning began during the summer of 1974 in preparation for the following school year. In the first few days of school, heavy backlash was immediate.
When I turned 6 in 1976, they bused me to the Henry Grew Elementary School, which was in Hyde Park. Hyde Park was a neighboring town, but it wasn't a town that my family went to. My family lived in Mattapan. We did everything in Mattapan. We never went to Hyde Park. We didn't even own a car, so there would have been no need for us to even drive through Hyde Park. So it was a completely new and different experience to be bused from my house to Hyde Park. The one memory that really stands out for me about busing was like seeing people grown like adults with signs. That was extremely disconcerting for me, being on a bus and then seeing adults holding up signs that said niggers go home and chanting like niggers go home. And some of them had bananas, and it was awful. And they threw rocks at the bus, and my brother, who was not as much of a pacifist, shall we say, as I was, would try to open up the window of the bus to throw things back at the crowds, and it was extremely scary. And I just remember like screaming and crying and wondering what was going on, and I wanted my mommy.
Certainly, the initial execution of busing was burdened by massive protests. Issues remained, however, when students arrived at their new schools.
There was violence. There was violence, and school buses were stoned. There were fights in schools. I believe there was one stabbing. There was this real resistance. Black parents knew their kids were going into this maelstrom, but were hoping for the best. Eventually the police have to come out and provide protection and support. Certainly schools were dealing with fights and just the disruption on a massive scale. So that was usually the depiction and sort of the reality of it.
Protests were rampant for the first few months, but after a little while, things began to settle down.
I think it's going to be all right if everybody comes and stop being scared, because, shoot, I don't think there's nothing to be scared of.
But it just got used to Southie High, and it's hard to adjust to another school.
How do you think things are going to work out here at Roxbury High?
I guess it'll work out all right. If the parents just stay out of it all and let the kids work it out for themselves, it'll be all right.
Over 1/3 of students left Boston public schools in the first year, but the remaining students were able to settle into routine.
Throughout Boston, there are not very many schools that actually have, a mix of students of color and white students, especially once you get past elementary school. I mean, there are a few elementary schools that have a little bit of more of a mix, but after that, the middle schools and high schools by far are all students of color. So, I mean, the experiment clearly did not work if the goal was to actually have folks talking, learning, and living together.
We really could have used more city, I would actually say more clergy and more neighborhood activism to make this happen. And I don't think anybody is spared blame in that. But I think personally look at the city as sort of being the leader, like it's our city. Where's our mayor? Where's the school committee? Where are they in terms of leading how this is going to happen? Instead, most just said, all right, Garrity, you did it, you fix it. And they all sort of backed away instead of embracing, like, these are our kids, our communities, our schools, let's figure out how to make this work. They just kind of pushed it to him. And so while I don't think it necessarily worked, I also don't think, one, that he had a lot of options, and two, that the city didn't embrace his decision. They just sort of said, okay, well, this is what we have to deal with. And so, yeah, as much as I do think it fails, I think it's unfair to say busing just failed. Nobody took approach to think of how could we make busing work.
The busing plan introduced in 1974 stayed prevalent until 1988, when the Boston School Committee regained full control over the plan. While busing was a solution to a pressing problem, it ended up causing many problems and a lot of violence in Greater Boston. Desegregation was a pressing issue that was past due for a solution, and while the busing solution tried its best to be that remedy, a lack of compliance from school officials and protests from parents, combined with racial clashes, led to busing being an ultimately unsatisfactory solution to integrating Boston's public schools. After 1988, busing was slowly reduced over the years, and in 1999, mandatory busing based on race was dropped entirely. The system of busing students from district to district, however, remains in place to this day. METCO, a voluntary busing program that seeks to, quote, expand educational opportunities, increase diversity, and reduce racial isolation by permitting students in Boston and Springfield to attend public schools in other communities that have agreed to participate, unquote. This program is still in operation to this day. Overall, while the execution of Boston's desegregation busing plan was ultimately flawed, it was a necessary step towards the integration of Boston schools, and some of its core principles are still in place to this day in the form of METCO.